It is Boston where the Revolution can truly be said to have been born, as it was the center of opposition to British tax and trade policies in North America. Ever since 1768, British troops had been stationed in the city, and their presence was deeply resented. After several violent incidences, the British government announced in 1774 that to punish the unruly Bostonians, the port of Boston would be closed until further notice. On April 18, 1775, General Thomas Gage, commander of the British force in Boston, ordered his subordinate, Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith, to lead a detachment of troops to the town of Concord. Gage had received word that arms, ammunition, and other supplies were being gathered in Concord for an uprising against the British Crown. Smith's orders were to seize, destroy all artillery, ammunition, provisions, tents, small arms, and all military stores whatsoever. The enduring fame of the Old North began on the evening of April 18, 1775, when the church sexton Robert Newman and vestryman Captain John Pulling Jr. climbed the steeple and held 2 lanterns as a signal for Paul Revere that the British were coming to Lexington and Concord by sea across the Charles River and not by land. This fateful event ignited the American Revolution. The church itself was built in 1723. It's also known as the Christ Church in the city of Boston, or the Old North Church. It's Boston's oldest surviving church building and the most visited historic site. In 1775, on the eve of the Revolution, the majority of the congregation were loyal to British king, and many held office positions with the royal government, including the royal governor of Massachusetts, making Robert Newman's loyalty to the patriot cause even more extraordinary. The king gave the Old North Church its silver that was used during services and its Bible. Under orders from General Gage, Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith led a detachment of roughly 900 British soldiers to seize military supplies that were being assembled by members of the Massachusetts militia in the town of Concord. However, the militia leaders had received word, in part through their efforts of Paul Revere, that the British were on their way and they had prepared an ambush. As they passed through the village of Lexington, the British came under fire from a small force of militiamen. The British heavily outnumbered this group, though, and the militiamen were forced to retreat. A more substantial skirmish erupted as the British crossed a bridge just outside of Concord. The Massachusetts militia inflicted heavy damage on the enemy, and while the British managed successfully to withdraw to Boston, Smith's mission had been a complete failure. In the 1837 poem by Ralph Waldo Emerson, the fighting at Concord was famously described as the shot heard round the world. After the Americans' victory at Concord, a force of roughly 10,000 Massachusetts militiamen advanced on Boston and declared the city under siege. Actually, it was an incomplete siege since the British were freely able to move troops and supplies into and out of the city by sea. Nevertheless, the presence of rebel forces just outside of Boston was a great embarrassment to the British pride. So General Gage ordered an amphibious assault against the American forces north of the city, in hopes of seizing the rebel headquarters and breaking the siege. Suspecting that the British might attempt something along the lines, the Americans began to fortify Bunker Hill, which overlooked the coast. Once Gage learned that the new fortifications were going up, he ordered an assault against Bunker Hill, as well as the nearby Breed's Hill. The British launched 2 attacks, both of which were repulsed by the American fire. However, the British had nearly 2-to-1 numerical advantage, and the third assault finally drove the rebels from the 2 hills. Yet the battle was extremely costly for the British. Out of the 2,600 engaged, more than 1,000 were killed or wounded. Gage, therefore, did not press the attack. The siege of Boston continued until March 17, 1776, when the British withdrew to Halifax, Nova Scotia. It was the Battle of Bunker Hill that convinced the British government that this was no minor rebellion. What they had faced was a full-scale revolution, one that would require a large army and probably the hiring of foreign troops as well. The monument you look at now symbolizes the conviction and determination of the New England soldiers who faced a powerful British attack on the site of June 17, 1775. Today, the Bunker Hill Monument stands atop a prominence of the battlefield known as Breed's Hill. It is 221-foot granite obelisk marks the site where the colonial forces constructed an earthen fort or redoubt prior to the battle. This fortress became the focal point of the British assault during the battle and remains the focal point of the battle's memory. While the main British force in America remained bottled up in Boston, the Continental Congress, meeting in Philadelphia, organized a Continental Army under the command of George Washington. The Congress also hoped to take advantage of the British Army's inactivity by launching an invasion of Canada. Many residents of the 13 colonies believed that Canadians also sought to rid themselves of British rule and hoped to spark a popular rebellion, thereby invading. In September of 1775, an American force under the command of General Richard Montgomery marched northward from the Fort Ticonderoga in New York. In early November, they reached the city of Montreal, which fell with virtually no resistance on November 13th. Montgomery then turned to the northeast, advancing his men along the St. Lawrence River towards Quebec, which was at that time the capital of British Canada. Two American forces converged to attack Quebec, the capital city of British Canada. The first, 300 men commanded by General Montgomery, proceeded up the St. Lawrence River from Montreal. The second, 1,100 men, under the command of Benedict Arnold, marched 350 miles northward from Boston, throughout a wilderness that is today the state of Maine. Arnold's forces arrived first in November, despite having arrived with only 600 of the original 1,100 men, and with virtually no supplies. Arnold ordered an attack on the city. With fewer than 100 defenders, it seemed possible even for Arnold's expeditions to capture Quebec, even in its weakened condition. However, Quebec was heavily fortified and Arnold lacked cannons. When the city's garrison refused to surrender, the general called off the assault and decided to wait for reinforcements. Montgomery arrived in early December with his 300 men, and more importantly, much-needed supplies. The two commanders immediately began planning their new attack, and this occurred on the morning of December 31st. This soon proved disastrous as a snowstorm blew up, rendering the American muskets useless. Within a short time, Montgomery had been killed and Arnold wounded, and by 10, a British counterattack had resulted in nearly half of the Americans being captured. Arnold and his remaining forces pulled back, but refused to evacuate the area. Early in 1776, a substantial British force arrived in Quebec, under the command of General John Burgoyne. The Americans finally withdrew, with the British on their heels, all the way back to Fort Ticonderoga. The invasion of Canada had been a miserable failure. Having abandoned Boston in March of 1776, the British decided to focus their efforts on New York. This they entrusted to two remarkable brothers of the Howe family. Rear Admiral Richard Howe was the commander of all British naval forces in North America, while a large force of troops, roughly a third of which were Haitian mercenaries from modern-day Germany, was placed under the command of General William Howe. This massive invasion force appeared off the coast of New York on June 29th. The Howe's orders were to take New York City, then proceed northward along the Hudson River, eventually meeting up with General Burgoyne's forces heading south from Canada. On July 3rd, General Howe and his men landed on Staten Island, which he planned to use as a base for his assault on New York City. There was little indication that the Continental Congress was intimidated by this move, as on the very next day in Philadelphia, the Declaration of Independence was formally approved. On August 22nd, General Howe began sending his forces across the narrow channel that separates Staten Island from Long Island, and within a few days there were over 20,000 British and Haitian troops in Brooklyn. General George Washington, commander of the Continental Army, sent roughly 10,000 men under the command of Israel Putnam to slow down the British advance, while Washington and the rest of the Continental Army prepared for an expected attack on Manhattan. In the action that followed, over 300 of Putnam's men were killed, and another 1,400 captured or missing. Total British losses were fewer than 400. 3 days later, under the cover of darkness, Putnam's remaining forces evacuated Long Island to join Washington's army in Manhattan. On September 15, Howe landed on Manhattan. Recognizing that the Continental Army was insufficient to prevent the British from taking New York City, Washington ordered a withdrawal. Having abandoned Manhattan to the British, Washington re-established his lines on high ground near the village of White Plains. On October 28th, General Howe launched an attack which drove the Continental Army from the field at a cost of some 230 men. At this point, Howe missed the best chance to destroy Washington's army once and for all. Instead of pursuing, he stopped and ordered construction of artillery batteries on the heights. This gave Washington the opportunity to retreat further north, taking his supply and wounded men with him. In November of 1776, Washington and his Continental Army managed to slip back into Pennsylvania with British forces in hot pursuit. However, in early December, General Howe ordered his army to cease operations for the winter. The Continental Army, he concluded, was no longer worthy of the trouble. He could wait until the spring to resume his advance on Philadelphia. With the British pursuit called off, the Continental Army encamped in a town of Valley Forge, just outside of Philadelphia. By this time, Washington had fewer than 5,000 men fit for duty, and he realized that all but 1,400 of these were likely to head home after the re-enlistment expired at the end of the year. Thomas Paine, who accompanied the army during this retreat, called these weeks the time that tried men's soul. Washington then tried the unexpected. On Christmas Day, he and his men quietly crossed the Delaware River and headed towards Trenton, where 3 regiments of Haitian mercenaries were stationed for the winter. On the morning of the 26th, the Continental Army attacked, taking the enemy completely by surprise. By 9:30 a.m., the fighting was over. Roughly 100 Haitians had been killed and nearly 900 others captured, with only a handful of Americans lost. By noon, Washington and his men had withdrawn back across the river into Pennsylvania, carrying their prisoners and captured supplies with them. Encircling the column just above the cap are 13 electric lights, symbolizing the original 13 colonies, shed their radiance at night. The pavilion is surmounted by the acacia leaves pedestal, where atop the structure, a colossal bronze statue of General George Washington crowns the monument. Washington is depicted as he appeared on the opening of engagement, directs the fire of the Continental artillery down King Street. The figure is 13 feet tall, while the monument, including the statue, is 150 feet above street level. On the base of the pedestal are 2 bronze relief panels depicting the Continental Army crossing the Delaware and the opening of the battle. The latter panel depicts the battery of Alexander Hamilton about to fire down King Street. A 3rd bronze relief panel, the surrender of the Haitians, was modeled on the north side of the pedestal in bronze tablet presented by the Society of Cincinnati of New Jersey. Guarding the entrance of the monument stands 2 bronze figures of Continental soldiers. One is a statue of Private John Russell, a member of Colonel John Glover Marblehead's regiment of seafaring men from Marblehead, Massachusetts, who gained fame by transporting Washington's army across the ice-choked Delaware River on the night of December 25th, December 26, 1776. The other figure is a model after the likeness of Private Blair McKellican of Philadelphia's Light Horse Troop, a unit which also took part in the battle. General Washington sought to follow up his victory at Trenton by attacking the British in New Jersey before ceasing operations for the winter. So on December 30th, the Continental Army crossed Delaware once more. For a moment it appeared that this foray, however, might end in disaster, as much larger British forces under General Cornwallis nearly trapped him at Trenton. But on January 3rd, Washington successfully eluded Cornwallis and headed north towards Princeton. There, the Continental Army encountered a small British force and inflicted 500 more casualties on the enemy. In a matter of days, Washington managed to drive the British from much of southern New Jersey. More importantly, his exploits re-energized the revolutionary cause, leading some 8,000 new recruits to join the Continental Army in the coming 3 months. This monument commemorates the January 3rd, 1777 Battle of Princeton and depicts General George Washington leading his troops to victory and the death of General Hugh Mercer. It stands 50 feet tall and was inspired by the carving of Arc de Triomphe in Paris. Designed to visually anchor the western end of Nassau Street, the monument and its park are the legacy of the City Beautiful movement. Although Washington's victory at Trenton and Princeton were welcome news for the supporters of the revolutionary cause, they did little to change the basic situation. In 1777, the British resumed their efforts in New York, which aimed at separating the New England states from the rest of the country. To carry out this plan, 10,000 British regulars under the command of General John Burgoyne headed south from Canada and along the shore of Lake Champlain. Meanwhile, a smaller force under General Barry St. Leger was to proceed through the Mohawk River Valley to meet up with Burgoyne at Albany. The most formidable obstacle standing between Burgoyne and Albany was Fort Ticonderoga, which 3,500 men garrison was commanded by General Arthur St. Clair. St. Clair was confident that Ticonderoga could hold off Burgoyne's army, but the fort suffered from one major weakness. If an enemy held the heights of a nearby mountain called Sugarloaf, he could pour cannon fire down on the interior of the fort. St. Clair had believed that Sugarloaf was too high for the British to move cannons to its peak. He was wrong. The Americans inside Fort Ticonderoga awoke on the morning of July 5th to find the British already setting up their artillery on the heights of Sugarloaf. Realizing that once the battery was complete and the British cannon could be able to pound the fort to rubble, General St. Clair ordered an evacuation that night under the cover of darkness. The British met with no resistance when they entered Ticonderoga on the following morning. While General Burgoyne was advancing south along Lake Champlain, a smaller British force was headed east. This British force consisted of 2,000 men, roughly half of which were Iroquois natives, and was commanded by General Barry St. Leger. On August 4th, St. Leger's troops surrounded Fort Stanwix, and 2 days later ambushed and destroyed a column of 800 local militia that were on their way to relieve the fort. Nevertheless, the defenders of Fort Stanwix refused to surrender, and as time passed on, St. Leger's Indian warriors, unaccustomed to sitting around and waiting for other sides to give up, began to desert. Meanwhile, General Benedict Arnold was frantically trying to put together a new force to relieve the fort. In the end, he could only raise 100 men for the purpose, so he resorted to trickery. He sent agents into the Mohawk Valley to spread the rumor that Arnold was on his way with a very large force. Ultimately, St. Leger became convinced that the rumor was true, lifted the siege of Fort Stanwix on August 20th, and headed back to Canada. While New York City firmly in British control and Burgoyne making his way steadfastly to the Hudson River, General Howe sought to capture Philadelphia, which he hoped would bring an end to the rebellion once and for all. In late July, an armada of more than 250 ships carried him and 17,000 British regulars through the Chesapeake Bay and landed them less than 50 miles from Philadelphia. Fortunately for the Americans, however, the landing area was muddy and from recent rains, so the act of unloading took far longer than expected. George Washington used the time to his advantage, rushing with his Continental Army, now about 11,000 men strong, to set up a strong defenses on the Chadds Ford on Brandywine River. However, rather than making a direct attack, Howe divided his forces. He sent 5,000 men to advance towards Washington, while the rest of the British army moved toward the right flank of the Continental Army. A dense fog on the morning of September 11th helped to hide Howe's movements, and in matters of hours, Washington was forced to retreat. Losses suffered at Brandywine were considerable. 1,000 Americans were killed or wounded, and more than 400 captured, while the British sustained nearly 600 casualties. However, the most immediate result of the battle was that nothing now stood between Howe and Philadelphia. The Continental Congress fled the city for York, Pennsylvania, and on September 26th, the British marched unopposed into the American capital. The capture of Fort Ticonderoga was a great success for General Burgoyne, but it was the last bit of good news he would receive. In August, he dispatched a raiding party of nearly 1,000 Haitian mercenaries to nearby Bennington, Vermont. But the mission ended in a disaster when they encountered a large force of local militia that were forced to surrender. This was followed by the news of Barry St. Legers had abandoned the siege at Fort Stanwix, and that Howe had shifted his focus away from New York in an effort to capture Philadelphia. Nevertheless, Burgoyne pressed onward, even though he now only had 7,000 men under his control. On September 13th, he crossed the Hudson River near the town of Saratoga, where the American General Horatio Gates was waiting with an army close to 10,000 men. What is usually called the Battle of Saratoga today actually consists of two separate battles fought nearly 3 weeks apart. In the first, sometimes called the Battle of Freeman's Farm, Benedict Arnold was able to hold off British attacks, but the result was otherwise inconclusive. Burgoyne's troops then dug entrenchments, hoping that they would be joined by soldiers from New York City. When this relief failed to materialize, Burgoyne ordered a final attack. In this second battle at Saratoga, sometimes called the Battle of Bemis Heights, not only was the British assault repulsed, but it was followed up by an American counterattack that drove Burgoyne's army from the field. Burgoyne withdrew into the town of Saratoga, but with fewer than 6,000 men remaining under his command, he realized that the situation was hopeless. He opened negotiations with Gates, and on October 17th, he and his army laid down their arms. Saratoga is generally thought to be the turning point of the American War for Independence. Although British forces still held New York and Philadelphia, the victory convinced French monarchy that the Continental Army had at least a decent chance of winning the war. In February of 1778, France became the first foreign country to recognize the United States of America, and this paved the way to activate French involvement in this conflict. The path here leads to the site of Burgoyne's headquarters, which at the time of the battles consisted of a large marquee or tent. It was established after the actions of September 19th and was the center of British command and camp life between the two battles. Burgoyne chose this location because of the nearby spring. Although the victory at Saratoga had restored the hopes of the revolutionary cause, the winter of 1777 to 1778 was a miserable one for George Washington's Continental Army. While British troops were quartered in the comfort of Philadelphia, Washington and his men spent the winter in nearby Valley Forge, desperately short of food and supplies. There were only two bright spots to this scenario. One was an announcement in February that France had recognized the independence of the United States, and the other was the work of the German volunteer named Friedrich Wilhelm Augustus von Steuben. Baron von Steuben, a former general in the Prussian army, spent much of that winter teaching military discipline and tactics to Washington's army. By June, General Henry Clinton, who had succeeded William Howe after the Saratoga campaign as commander of the British troops in North America, had become concerned that his position in Philadelphia was vulnerable to French attack. So, on the 18th, he evacuated the city and headed back towards New York. Washington decided to attack the British during their march, and on June 28th, the two armies clashed near Monmouth, New Jersey. The battle nearly ended in a disaster for the Continental Army when one general prematurely called a retreat. Washington, however, personally rallied the troops, inspiring them to repel two British counterattacks. In the end, the battle was inconclusive, and both sides lost many men to heat stroke. The temperature that day had exceeded over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. As to combat, but ultimately the British lost nearly 1,200 soldiers compared to the 500 casualties on the American side. In terms of numbers of participants, Monmouth was the largest single battle in the war, with over 13,000 soldiers on each side. It was also the last major battle of the Northern Theater. While the British continued to occupy New York City, General Clinton soon received orders for a new offensive in the Carolinas.